Everyone. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS. Welcome to our spring mini-series that we're sneaking in between Pesach and Shavuot here on relating to God. Apologies for the delay. It looks like I have a delay on my internet, so we were trying to fix it, but we didn't want to delay any further. So anyway, thank you for joining us. I hope everyone had a good Pesach. I was able to celebrate with family again for the first time in a while. I hope some of you were as well. We thought that this topic of relating to God is a small one, you know, like we could just deal with it in 5 sessions and be done. Let's talk about it. It's an easy one, right? Really, we talked about a lot of topics for the spring, you know, we could do years and years on this topic. So we decided to, you know, just spend 5 sessions and not even pretend that there can be anything exhaustive about exploring this idea of relating to God, how we conceive of God, how we relate to God, how we understand God and feel about God, or lack of any of those things. It could go on forever. But it is, you know, kind of a contemplative time between Pesach and Shavuot when we've been redeemed and we're working towards receiving the Torah. And both of those in the Bible are so much about relationship with God, right? Where God frees us from slavery in Egypt, and it's all about then kind of consummating that relationship through the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai on Shavuot. And we don't necessarily always think of the Torah as being about a relationship with God, but that's very much how the Torah understands itself, as the Torah as sort of God's gift to us, and our primary way of being in relationship to God. So that's why it seemed like a fitting topic for now, even though we will just have, you know, sort of 5 forays into 5 ways of thinking about it. And as I said, not attempt to be exhaustive in our treatment of the topic, but we thank you for joining us. Special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today. And we're so pleased to have Dr. Rachel Rosenthal teaching us today. I will turn it over to Tani for some announcements and to introduce Dr. Rosenthal.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. You know, also just wanted to welcome everyone to the first session in our new series. And I will just go over kind of how we typically do our Q&A. Dr. Rosenthal will pause for questions periodically throughout our session, and we'll also have time for Q&A at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Rosenthal. For any technical or logistical questions, you can initiate a private chat with either myself or with Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session, and will be screen shared as well. And I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Rosenthal. Dr. Rachel Rosenthal is an adjunct assistant professor of Talmud at JTS and a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. She received her PhD in rabbinic literature from JTS, where her dissertation focused on how rabbinic analysis of the case of the stubborn and rebellious son provides models for moral education and development. Dr. Rosenthal teaches in a variety of settings and has taught for us several times as part of our Monday series. We're so pleased to have her teaching again. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Rosenthal.
Thank you so much, Tani. Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. I'm really delighted to be here with all of you today, and I'm so glad that you've all shown up just 2 days after Pesach to start our journey to Mount Sinai together. One of the great ironies I've found of the work that I do, my primary job at JTS is teaching 1st and 2nd year rabbinical students, and I teach both Talmud and Halakha. And one of the great ironies of that work is we spend almost no time talking about God. And this is a very strange thing, right? How can it be that I'm helping to train clergy, and they spend between those two classes, that's roughly 50% of the time they spend in class in their first and second years of rabbinical school. And there's almost no conversation about God at all. Instead, we get into the minutia of the law, breaking down complicated Talmudic arguments, figuring out what practical legal applications might be applied to cases that could come up today. And somehow God is absent from the conversation. And I think that this is actually one of the interesting and somewhat unique features of Jewish religious life in general, and particularly in terms of the way we think about training clergy across all of the movements of Judaism, which is that there's a lot of focus on what we do, on our practice, and much less focus on what we believe, on how we think. And of course, there are certainly elements of that come in. And part of the reason that I don't teach about God is because I'm neither a philosopher nor a theologian. I am a Talmudist, which is a different sort of thing. But one of the great ironies, I think, is that the Talmud, which in many ways is I would argue, the central document of the Jewish religion as we have it today, of rabbinic Judaism, which is essentially modern Judaism, is that you can go a lot of time without thinking or talking about God at all. And that's not just true for us, it's true in the Talmud as well. But what I'd like us to do today, in the course of the next hour and 20 minutes or so, is look at 5 cases in the Talmud where God does come up. These are not by any means the only places where God comes up. God comes up in other places as well. But I'm interested in particular today to think about the role of prayer. And part of the reason why is we're, in addition to the ways of being unusual among other religions that I just talked about, that there's very little focus on conversation of belief and more conversation in what we do, there's not very much space in Judaism in the liturgy as it's traditionally built for spontaneous prayer. And instead, many of us, when we think about prayer and how prayer works, think about the words in the Siddur and whether we agree with those words, whether we understand those words, whether we pray in Hebrew or we pray in our vernacular. This sense that we're talking to God on one hand is certainly there, but on the other hand, there's absolutely an element in that process of what does it mean for me to recite words, not necessarily that reflect what I'm feeling in that moment, but instead that reflect the words that people generations and generations before me wrote and spoke. And on one hand, there's something really beautiful about that. I think there's something really amazing about the idea that the words of liturgy that we say today were the same words of liturgy that people were saying 2,000 years ago. But on the other hand, what happens in the moments where what I desire to pray and what the Siddur says in front of me don't line up? So this is not going to be a class on practical applications of prayer. But instead, this is what I was thinking about as I was preparing this class, because the thing that the 5 stories we're looking at today have in common is they're all cases where people pray, sometimes via traditional liturgy, sometimes via spontaneous prayer, where it seems that God is powerless to ignore the prayers of the people who are praying. And part of what's interesting about this is we usually think of prayer as being a way to sway God, to convince God to answer for things that we want, for things that we need, whether for ourselves or our families, our communities, or the whole world. But that we usually think of it as God can decide to answer or not. And in fact, if you look, for example, at the Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur liturgy, this is really the language that comes through. We see the language of, right, God, please, in your mercy, will you hear our prayers? But what we're going to see in these 5 stories is that God seems compelled to answer prayers, even against God's will. So that's all by way of background. Let's dive into the sources themselves so we can give them the time they deserve for treatment. And I'll pause after the first 2 stories and then after the 3rd and 4th stories together, and then we'll look at the 5th one. So feel free to send questions or comments to Rabbi Andelman in the chat as we go through. So the first story that we're going to look at comes from the Babylonian Talmud in Bava Metzia. And it's imagining a world that is fairly broken. This story takes place around the year 200. We don't know the exact dating, obviously, but the people who appear in it are the latest rabbis of the Mishnah and the earliest rabbis of the Gemara. So they live right on the seam, sometime in the years 200 in the land of Israel. This was a time of tremendous vulnerability for that community in the land of Israel. And that's just important context, I think, for us to keep in mind as we read through this story. So the Talmud says that Eliyahu, this is referring to Eliyahu Hanavi, to Elijah the prophet, who comes originally from the book of Kings. But one of the things we know about Elijah is that he never dies. He gets taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. And it means that he ends up serving first in the rabbinic imagination and then really throughout Jewish history as an intermediary between heaven and earth, because he is both, in certain ways, of both heaven and earth, and also of neither of them. And therefore he often serves as a messenger between the two. So Eliyahu used to come to the Beit Midrash of Rebbe. Rebbe is Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. He is the head of the Jewish community in the land of Israel. He is the editor and codifier of the Mishnah. Very, very important person. And Elijah apparently would come visit him in his Beit Midrash, in his study hall. One day, it was Rosh Chodesh. Rebbe expected him, but Eliyahu failed to come. Rebbe said to him once he arrived, "Why are you late?" I just love that moment, right? Imagine the chutzpah involved for an ordinary mortal to be able to say to Elijah the prophet, the great Elijah, who one day will lead the Messiah into Jerusalem and thus awaken the redemption of the world. But Rebbe just feels a little aggrieved, it seems, because Elijah is late. So he said to him, "Why are you late?" Eliyahu replied to Rebbe, "I had to wait until I awoke Abraham, washed his hands, he prayed, and I put him to rest again. Likewise for Yitzchak and for Yaakov." So apparently what Elijah has been doing is waking up each of the three avot, each of the three patriarchs, allowing each of them to say their morning prayers, apparently, and then putting them back to rest, i.e. putting them back to death. And what is noteworthy here is he seems to do them one at a time. So Rebbe understandably says back to Eliyahu, why not awake them together, right? We know from the Torah, they're all buried in the same place, right? It's so beautiful. Imagine this idea, father, son, and grandson, they can all pray together. So why not wake all of them together, Rebbe asks. And Eliyahu says to him, "I fear that they would grow too strong in prayer and bring the Messiah before its time." So what we see here is that there seems to be some sort of trigger that if prayers are strong enough, they can override the rules of the universe, presumably set into motion by God, and bring the Messiah, even though it is not the time for the Messiah to come. So this is a pretty extraordinary statement that Elijah is making. Now, Rebbe, who remember is living in this time of great difficulty and great upheaval, hears this and asks what I think is the rational next question. Are there those like this in this world? Meaning, are there those whose prayers are strong enough that they are able to bring the Messiah before its time? Eliyahu said back to him, "There is Rabbi Chia and his sons." Rebbe proclaimed a fast, and Rabbi Chia and his sons were called to lead the prayers. Rabbi Chia said the words, "He causes the wind to blow, Mashiv haruach," and a wind blew. He said he causes the rain to fall, Morid hagashem, and the rain came. When he was about to say, Mechayeh hametim, he revives the dead, the world trembled. In heaven, right, so now the scene cuts. Imagine you're watching a movie. The screen goes black, we cut the scene, and we all of a sudden are up in heaven rather than in the Beit Midrash of Rebbe. And up in heaven, it was asked, who has revealed our secret to the world? And what's interesting about this is it's not clear who's speaking here. It just says Amre Barakia. They said. So it's not clear who the they is here. So who has revealed our secret in the world? They said, seemingly the angels. The angel said it was Eliyahu. Eliyahu was brought and struck with 60 flaming lashes. So he went and disguised himself as a fiery bear, entered among Rabbi Chia and his sons, and scattered them. So a few things I'd like to note about this story. The first is that I think there is an interesting way to look at the character of Eliyahu Hanavi in this particular story. Because I always wonder when Rebbe says to him, are there those like this in the world? If Eliyahu just lets it slip, or if Eliyahu secretly on some level wants to be part of this bringing of the Messiah before his time. Because Eliyahu clearly has this information, and at no point does he say to Rebbe, oh, no, I can't tell you that, or it's not appropriate for you to ask me that, or any of that. He just answers right away. And I always wonder what the implications would be for us to read that statement by Eliyahu as an accident versus reading it as being on purpose. Because I think part of what happens if we read it as it just slipped is it just slipped. He wasn't thinking, he just said it. But if we read it as being on purpose, I wonder what it says that Eliyahu also in certain ways wants to bring the Messiah before his time, and yet can't do so overtly such that he can wake up Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the same time. But he does feel like he can just say to Rebbe, right? And then theoretically, he could have plausible deniability in that situation. Of course, it doesn't work because he gets ratted out right away in the heavens. And it leads to this very, very painful sounding punishment. But I think there's something interesting about the idea that this prophet, this person who does not die the death of a person, who's sort of a person and sort of not a person, the idea that he too longs for the Messiah, even though he lives up in the heavens and he has these direct relationships with God, with God's angels, there's something I think really striking about the idea that he too wants to hasten the redemption of the world. The second thing I want to point out here is it seems to me that Rabbi Chia and his sons have no idea that this is why Rebbe has asked them to pray. Usually, and we'll see this in a minute when we go to source number 2, usually in rabbinic literature, when you call a fast, it's because there's been a drought. And the idea is, the assumption is based on certain biblical passages, particularly one at the very end of the book of Leviticus, another one in the book of Deuteronomy. The assumption is that when it doesn't rain in the land of Israel, it is a sign of God's displeasure with the Israelites, or now with the Jewish people. That is how God expresses anger at the people. And therefore, in order to get it to rain again, what you do is you fast and you pray special penitential prayers. And the hope is that in that act of repentance, God will bring the rain back to you again. That's the general theology. When we look at this, what we see is that Rabbi Chia and his sons don't seem to have an understanding of the fact that their prayers are that powerful. And in fact, if any of you are familiar with traditional Jewish liturgy, you recognize that what they're saying are just the words that we say in the opening of the Amidah, right? Mashiv haroch umrid hagashem. We said it up until a week and a half ago when Pesach began, at which point we stopped praying for rain because the rainy season in Israel is over. And then they're about to say the blessing of Mechayeh HaMeitim, right? The one who gives life to the dead. And that's the moment where Eliyahu pulls the plug on the whole thing. But I think there's something very powerful about the idea that there are people in the world who have the ability to have their prayers answered in basically any case, no matter what it is they're asking for, even if they don't realize that they are asking for it, and especially if they don't realize that they have the power to bring this thing that they're praying for about. Because I wonder a little bit what it would be like for us if we felt like every time we said the words Mechayeh HaMeitim, who give life to the dead, what would it be like for us if every time we said that, we genuinely believed that we might be able to bring about the resurrection of the dead, right? Imagine how your experience of prayer would feel in that moment, potentially different. Now, some of you might feel that way when you pray, in which case that's amazing. I have seldom, if ever, accessed that particular experience. So I think there's something very striking and very beautiful about the idea that you have these people who are so righteous and so focused in their prayer that they have the ability to bring about the redemption of the world, even before God wants that to happen. And yet, I think it's only because they don't know that they can do it that they are able to do it. The third thing, and this again will be in contrast to what we see in story number 2, which is why we're going to look at them together. The third thing I want to point out is that in both cases, the people who have the power to bring this redemption of the world about, even against God's will or against God's plan, in all cases, it's not a single individual, but it's a group of 3. And we know that a group of 3 is important in other places in Judaism. For example, you need a court of 3 in order to be able to do certain legal mechanisms that 1 or 2 people are not enough, but instead you require the third. And so to here, it's almost as if Rabbi Chia and his sons, or Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they would be serving almost like a Beit Din of sorts, like a court of sorts. And in which case, it's almost as if they have assembled a court to go before God and argue their case. And I'm interested in us thinking about what it would mean if we thought of prayer as not just words that we say or a way for us to access spirituality or to access the feeling of being in community, but we felt like we were advocates going forward and trying to make our case. And again, this is similar to the liturgy that we see in around the Yamim Noraim, around Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, this idea that it's very important that that we advocate for ourselves, but that also us doing so in a group is more powerful than us doing so as individuals. So this is model number 1. Model number 1 is the case of the people who don't know that they have the power to do this, but whose prayers are so pure and so powerful, and we don't know why these are the people who are chosen, but their prayers are so pure and so powerful that they have the ability to bring about the redemption of the world. I'd like to put this in contrast now to model number 2, which is what we'll go to next. Model number 2 comes from Masechet Ta'anit, or from the Mishnah in Ta'anit. So Ta'anit is a fast, and this particular tractate is all about the procedure around fasts that are called due to drought, due to lack of rain. And chapter 3 in particular is about what happens when very bad things have befallen a place, including drought, including plague, including attacks by wild animals. Again, all of these are taken as signs of God's displeasure, and therefore signs that we have to change our behavior. And a little bit unusually for the Mishnah here in Ta'anit tells a story. The Mishnah generally is not narrative in character; it's mostly legal based in its discourse. But in this particular case, we have a story. So the Mishnah starts by saying, for every hardship they wish to avoid falling on the community, blast the shofar for them, except on account of too much rain. So the Gemara, commenting on this Mishnah, explains that the reason why you don't pray for rain to go away is because rain is a blessing, and you never want to pray for the diminishment of a blessing, even if it comes in such a form that it has the potential to be destructive. So that is the introduction of the Mishnah. And then the Gemara goes on to say, the Mishnah goes on to say, it once happened that they said to Choni HaMa'agel, often translated as Choni, the circle person, Choni, the circle maker, Ma'agel is a circle, so Choni, the circle, pray that the rains may fall. We don't have from this Mishnah great context of who Choni is. We learn more about him in the Gemara. It's worth noting a couple of things about him. First of all, you'll notice he doesn't have the word rabbi in front of his name. Second of all, he is not a commonly occurring character in the Gemara. In fact, it's really just these narratives in Ta'anit chapter 3 where he's a main character, and otherwise he's essentially absent. So we don't know anything from this Mishnah about who this person is or why it is that they would go to him to ask for rain. So they say, pray that the rains may fall. He, Choni, said to them, meaning whoever has come to him, go out and bring in the clay ovens for the Paschal sacrifices so that they will not, Tani, if we can just scroll a little, thank you, dissolve. So he's clearly very confident in his ability to do this, because he basically says as soon as they come to him, oh, no problem, right? I'm going to make this happen. And it's going to rain so much that these clay ovens that they would use, right? There were many ovens that they would use for the Paschal sacrifice, because This was the one sacrifice that everyone took part in it at the same time. So you would need a lot of ovens for people to cook them. And so this is a sign of his confidence that you have to take these ovens in. So what happened? He prayed, but the rains did not fall. And we don't know what he prayed. The Mishnah doesn't tell us what he prayed, just that he prayed. What did he do? What did Choni do? He drew a circle and stood within it and said before God, Master of the universe, your children have turned their faces to me, for I am like a member of your household. I swear upon your great name that I will not move from here until you have had mercy on your children. Rain began to come down in small drops. Choni said, I did not ask for this, but for rains to fill pits, ditches, and caves. The raindrops began to come down angrily. So we went from before it was raining very, very sort of misting, very small drops. Now it's an angry downpour. Choni said again, I did not ask for this, but for rains of benevolence, blessing, and generosity. The rains fell in their normal way until Israel went up out of Jerusalem to the Temple Mount, which is meant to be high ground, because of the rains. They came and said to him, just as you prayed for them that they should fall, so pray that they should go away. He said to them, go out and see if the stone of strayers has been washed away. So this is mostly parenthetical, but just so we know what they're talking about, this stone of strayers is on the 3 harvest festivals, on Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot. The assumption was that everyone would go up to the temple in order to make sacrifices and to celebrate. And in the course of doing so, if you found a lost object over the course of the period of time between one festival and the next, you are supposed to go to this central location, the stone of strayers, or stone of claimants is another way it's sometimes translated. You are supposed to go there, and hopefully whoever it is that lost the item will come and find you. So it's basically the world's largest lost and found, and it's very, very big, and it's at a very central location. So the idea being, if it has rained enough that this giant stone has been washed away, then that's really a sign that we've had a tremendous amount of rain. Shimon ben Shetach, who was the Nasi, he was the head of the court, he's the leader of the community in the land of Israel, sent for Choni and said to him, if you were not Choni, I would decree a ban upon you, meaning I would temporarily excommunicate you. But what should I do for you? For you act like a spoiled child before God, and yet God does your will for you, like a son who acts like a spoiled child with his father, and yet his father does his will for him. And about you, the verse says, this is a verse from Proverbs chapter 23, your father and mother shall be glad, and she who bore you shall rejoice. I imagine that at least some of you have seen this story again. This story has made its way into what I think of as rabbinic fairy tale lore, as do some other stories about Choni, because Choni is really this interesting miracle maker character, who, as I said, we don't know very much about him. We'll see some things about his offspring later on in these stories, but there's very little that we're told about him, including we don't know why it is that he is the person who merits to have his prayers answered. But part of what's interesting is if we look at this story and this model in contrast with the one that came before, part of what is very striking is the seeming, at least, humility of Rabbi Chia and his sons, that they have no idea that they have the ability to access this sort of power in their prayer, whereas Choni knows exactly what he's doing, and not only that, but expects to have his prayers answered. And not only expects to have his prayers answered, but expects to have them answered in a particular way. And part of what always strikes me when I look at this story is I really wonder about the role of God in this story, because what we see is that Choni has to ask 3 times for the rain, actually 4 times, right? The first prayer, which may or may not be traditional liturgy said on these fast days, these penitential prayers, we don't know exactly what he prayed in that case. That one doesn't work at all. The second one is basically him saying, I won't move from here until you give me what you want. Until you give me what I want, rather. And then God gives him really a concession, very, very tiny drops of rain, which seemed to me when I read this story that potentially part of the role of that is to let Choni leave his circle with his reputation intact. Because if God says, okay, I'll give you these tiny, tiny bits of rain, part of the effect of that is technically Choni has gotten what he's asked for, but God has not had to give a full rain to the people who presumably have not received rain up to this point because God feels that they don't deserve it, right? That's the particular theology behind drought. The second set of rain is also destructive, but in a different way. The first one is destructive in that it won't alleviate the drought. The second one is destructive in that it's destroying things, right? This is a big downpour that leads to floods and the like. And in those cases, it's true that the rain is abundant, but it's not abundant in a positive way. And so again, what it seems to me is God is giving Choni a way to say, look, my prayers were answered. I got what I asked for, without God having to lift this drought that's been imposed on the people. It's only when Choni asks for something very, very specific, right, that it should be a reign of benevolence, blessing, and generosity. The Hebrew is ratzon, bracha, unedava. It's only in that moment that they finally get this productive rain, and thus it seems that the punishment is lifted. It feels to me, though, part of why I keep coming back to this story is it feels that the punishment is lifted almost against God's will. It doesn't seem to me when I read this story that God actually wants to lift the drought. It seems to me when I read this story that God is somehow compelled to lift the drought and first tries to do so in a way that Choni's prayers can be answered without God having to remove the message of, I would like these people to be punished. And part of what's interesting in the story when I look at it is I always wonder if the community as a whole had already tried collectively praying for this drought to be lifted and it simply hadn't been effective, or if they went to Choni right away. And part of the reason that I think that question matters is if they go to Choni right away, it feels to me like maybe part of the reason that they're in this drought is because they're totally alienated from God and they have outsourced their spiritual work to a third party, in this case, Choni, rather than doing that work themselves. And I think that this is something that people really struggle with in terms of traditional liturgy, especially if you're in a community that is maybe less knowledgeable of Hebrew language or of that liturgy, is there's often a sense that I show up to synagogue and the rabbi or the cantor, they can lead the prayers and then I can have fulfilled my obligation, right? They can make me yotze. They can fulfill my obligation for me. And I've done my job by showing up. But that's not what leads to the camaraderie that we see in the first story, Rabbi Chia and his sons. And I think it's worth noting here that it's Choni as an individual, as opposed to Rabbi Chia having to join with his sons. So even as Choni's prayers get answered, at least my impression when I read this story is similar to the one of Shimon ben Shetach, which is, I don't really think it's necessarily appropriate to behave this way before God, except that God responds to it. And actually, the spoiled child analogy feels very, very apt to me, because Choni is essentially throwing a temper tantrum. He's saying, I will not move from this place until you give me what I want. Now, what he wants is for the communal good. And I don't mean to therefore equate it with a child who says, give me candy or I won't move, right? Obviously, those two things are not the same. But I think it's worth us taking a minute to note what exactly it means for God to be punishing this entire community and then responding when there's a single child or in this adult, but childlike figure who just says, I'm not going to move until you give me what I want. And for some reason, that's what God responds to. And that's why I asked the question of what happened before this. Was there communal prayer or not? Because I could imagine why God would not want to respond if there wasn't previous communal prayer, because that suggests that people haven't learned their lesson at all. And I'll just say, and then we'll pause for questions, that there is a Israeli sketch comedy group called Hayudim Ba'im, the Jews are coming. And one of the sketches, and what they do is they do sketches of events in Jewish history and also biblical and Talmudic events. And one of the sketches that they have is about Choni. And what they imagine is that everyone else wants to come and stand in the circle with Choni too. Because they say, oh, look, God listens to your prayers. That's so cool. And so it starts with Choni saying, I am Choni, the circle man, and I will not move from this place. But by the time you get to the end of the video, There are so many people standing in the circle, and Choni's really mad about it because he wants this to be his thing. So he's feeling angry. And then what happens at the end? An ice cream truck comes by and everyone runs away except to get ice cream because it's so hot, except for Choni. But he says, bring me a chocolate cone. And so I think there's something very, it's you can find it on YouTube if you have good Hebrew. They don't have a captioned version, unfortunately. But I think there's something very striking about that story, because part of the reason it seems that maybe Choni likes what he's doing so much is because he is Choni Hamagel, right? He is the person who can do this. There's a power involved in that. And that I think is part of what, it's that sense of importance, maybe even more than the sense of, I actually want the rain. It's a sense of, let me show everyone that God can listen to me or will listen to me, which is difficult, but at the same time, clearly effective. And so I think the theology of this story, I find much more complicated than the one of the first story, because you lack that, the humility and the lack of self-awareness that makes the first version, I find really beautiful. The second version I find really, really theologically challenging. But I'm going to pause there because I imagine some questions have come in. So I'd love to hear a couple of thoughts that have come in.
Great, thank you. So I think the contrasts you were just drawing are really interesting. But also the two stories have the thing in common that there's someone or people, right, who God listens to more than other people, and God seems like that's just the way things are, and we don't have any indication that that there's anything wrong with that. Like it seems like God maybe wants things that way, or God has arranged things that way. So that's right. That's sort of troubling. I'm really thinking from a contemporary perspective, right? The idea that God listens more to some people's prayers than others. And it also made me think about when I was a congregational rabbi, and we have some congregational rabbis on the Zoom right now. When I would visit congregants who were sick, and they would ask me to pray for them, and to keep me in their prayers, and there was, for a while, it made me feel very uncomfortable. I was like, my prayers are not more important than anyone else's prayers. And at a certain point, I just made peace with that, and I said, you know what, yeah, I'm happy to pray for them, and there have been times when I asked other people to pray for me too, and it's not about being, the rabbi, but I think that a lot of people do see the prayers of, and you were talking about in a synagogue context, but I'm talking about really more kind of from the heart, prayers for healing kind of thing, right? People think that the rabbi or the priest or whoever has a more direct line. So I don't know. I guess partly I'm curious to know what what all of our friends here think about that idea. Is that troubling, or is it not troubling? Maybe we're comfortable with that. I don't know. That's what I think is sort of screaming out. I can share a few things that people.
I'd like to say one thing about that.
Let's hear what you have to say first.
So I just want to say, imagine if all of us prayed as if we might be the ones who had that power, right? I think that's the way to invert this, rather than saying, oh, I outsource it to this other person because they're more spiritually connected to me. Imagine if I was able, when I prayed, to have the intention of, I could be the person who brings about redemption to the world or healing to something that's broken, if I was able to pray with the proper intention. I think that would really, for me, enliven my spiritual life. I've never been able to access that, but I think that that's the flip side, is Rabbi Chia and his sons don't know that it's them, but they're clearly able to pray just in case it is, as if just it is in case it is them. And I think there's a lot of power in that, because what it suggests is, we don't necessarily know who the person is whose prayers will be heard. And it could be one person who prays on behalf of the entire community. But that person might not be the one standing up on the bima. So I think it's the flip side. But yeah, that responsibility of my job is to be the conduit between God and this entire community. I mean, I'm not a rabbi, but yeah, that seems very stressful. But I'm happy to take some questions.
That's a beautiful response. So I'm gonna it's mostly comments actually when I'm getting
Great.
my questions. But I just need to share one more thing, which was from before, not a rabbinic thing, but I had once a friend in Israel who was when I was already back here after a few years in Israel, who was the victim of a terrorist stabbing attack and was stabbed dozens of times, like within less than an inch of his life. And after I found out about that, I prayed in a way that I don't think I've ever prayed in my whole life for anything. And I also felt, I don't know, it was this, for me, really once in my lifetime experience of feeling like my prayers were going somewhere and contributing to what ended up being a miraculous healing. It's just an interesting, you just made me think about that that time when you talked about imagining, each one of us imagining we're the one. All right, so people are raising some comparisons to other stories where you have kind of, a figure who emerges, who prays on behalf of the community. So one of those is Abraham on behalf of Sodom and Amorah, which maybe is more like the first story. Then now this isn't a situation of prayer, but a rabbinic story that has a complex result is the oven of Achnai, which we've looked at, not in this session, obviously, but in a few sessions over the last couple of years, where the question is, resolving a legal, there's a dispute among the sages about a legal matter, and Rabbi Eliezer sort of appeals to the heavens for a response, and that gets very complicated. So people have raised both of those, and I wonder if you want to react to either, in terms of comparing and contrasting.
So in terms of the oven of Achnai story, what's interesting there is that people often end that particular story after God laughs and says, "My children have defeated me." But the way that story actually ends is with Rabbi Eliezer falling on his face and praying, and then it leads to the death of Rabban Gamliel. So in that case, prayer is actually very destructive. And there his prayer comes from grief, and his wife, who is Rabban Gamliel's sister, because that's always how it works in the Talmud, rivals are always related somehow. His wife had been stopping him from praying because she knew this is what was going to happen. And after it happens, right, he doesn't mean to kill Rabban Gamliel, it's just his grief is so intense that ends up being the effect. And he says to her at the end, "How did you know?" And she says, "Because all of the gates of heaven are locked except for the gates of those who were wronged." Right. So she just knows that when someone cries out in pure grief, that God is helpless from ignoring those prayers. But what's complicated in that story is, first of all, we know that's not true, right? It's not true that when people cry out in pure grief, that their prayers are always answered. But the other thing that's complicated is what the grief leads to is not a healing, but actually a further destruction. So that's part of what's, I think, interesting and complicated in that particular story. In terms of Abraham and Sodom and Amorah, you can argue sort of either way. You can argue that Abraham's prayers do work there because God agrees that if there are fewer than 10 and more than 10 in the city, then God won't destroy the city. But ultimately there aren't, and the city gets destroyed, right? So Abraham's prayer is partially answered. And there it's interesting because it takes the form of prayer. Abraham speaks as if in prayer, but really it's a dialogue. And of course, the ideal in prayer is that it should feel like a dialogue, but it often doesn't. But what would it be like if when we prayed, God said to us, like, "Yes, I hear you," but sometimes the answer is no, right? People talk about that, the feeling the absence of God versus God saying, "I hear you," but the answer is no, and what the implications would be of either of those two theologies, which one feels more comforting to people, and neither feels particularly comforting. But thinking about what that might mean. And therefore the sense of, but yes, God is hearing me, right? Because sometimes we feel like we're crying out from the depths and nobody can hear us at all. And yeah, Abraham gets heard and ultimately he gets what he asks for. It's just that it's still not enough. But we see that there, right? We see the story of Moses. Moses prays for Miriam to be healed, and that is effective. He's able to do that. So there certainly are stories of, but then David prays for his baby son to live. The child he conceives with Bathsheba out of adultery. He prays for that child to live, and there the answer is no, right? And it's seen as a punishment for David. But I think part of what those stories remind us of, as in contrast with the ones that I brought here, is that just because the answer is no, that doesn't mean God isn't listening. And so adding that other elements of it into the conversation, I think is interesting and important, for sure.
Thank you. Just FYI, there are a handful of people who kind of expressed a lot of comfort with the idea of kind of outsourcing to an expert, right? That's pointing out that we do that in plenty of other settings, and see that as appropriate, and it's a way of reading this also. So another question that came up, and maybe this will be the last one for this round, because I know you have other texts for us. It's just, there was sorry, there's so much coming in. A lot of comments and personal experiences with which I just want to thank everyone for sharing. There was interest in hearing more about kind of the personal versus communal prayer, right? You mentioned, we sort of have to assume, I guess, or want to assume that there was communal prayer before Choni came along and solved things. So there's an individual praying on behalf of the community in a case like that, or like Abraham. And then there's also individual prayer for yourself, right? For oneself, versus kind of communal or Jewish communal or global causes. I don't know if that's something you were going to touch on in other sources, or if you want to comment on that.
Well, it's interesting. Really, the first communal prayer that we see in the Torah, we actually read on the seventh day of Pesach, which is Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea. That after the Israel, it's not a song of asking; it's a song of thanksgiving. But if you look at the right, Ajah Shir Moshe Uvnei Israel, that song Moses and the people of Israel. So there we do have a notion of prayer as being communal. We know that our prayers date back at least to the time of, not all of them, but some of them at least in some form date back at least to the time of the Mishnah. We can see that historically if you look in the Talmud. The rabbis like to claim that prayer is very old, and that's partly about them claiming the mantle of continuity, that even after the temple is destroyed, the claim that prayer is an acceptable modality of relationship with God instead of just sacrifices. So that's what happens there. But look, part of the role of communal prayer is because prayer is meant to be communal, right? Why do we have a set liturgy? Partly because there are certain boxes that we're supposed to check off, but also because if all of us are together but praying for our own things, then that's not a communal experience. But this idea that we all, sing the words of the Shema together, or we all say the Amida in whatever form together, that it's because there's an assumption that our prayers added together are more powerful than the sum of them together is more powerful than each of the individual pieces. And so I don't think it's just a rigidity. There are certain topics that the rabbis want us to hit on, but I think the other piece of it is just practical, which is how can we come to join together in prayer, right? And you'll notice that in the first story, they're clearly using a set liturgy. And even though they're the ones leading the prayers, other people are present as well. As opposed to in the second story, Choni is not using a set liturgy. He is praying spontaneously, and it's just him. There's no room for anyone else in that experience. And I think the question is, how do we build a prayer life that has space for both of those things at the same time, which is very complicated for reasons that I assume are obvious, but I think that's meant to be the ideal. And there's an assumption, for example, that when one says the Amida, when you're praying silently, there are actually places added in where you can add your own individual prayers as well. And so it's not meant to be, we only say the set words of the liturgy, but I think because that's what we see when we go to synagogue, and the parts that are out loud are set liturgy for obvious reasons, that's what people end up getting fixated on. And I've heard, I'll say one more thing about this and then we'll go on with the sources, but I've heard from some of my students that when they do CPE, when they do chaplaincy training, one of the things that's really difficult is that there's an expectation on the part of many of their patients, especially those who aren't Jewish, that they'll be able to do spontaneous prayer with them. And they don't feel, it's so not natural for them. And if they're in an interfaith CPE with people who are, say, training to become pastors or something like that, it's so common in at least certain parts of the Christian faith, not all of it, but certain parts of particularly Protestant faith, to have the spontaneous prayer, that it's a vocabulary that they lack when they're with patients who, or other people they're ministering to, who are used to that sort of prayer work. And it's actually a skill they have to cultivate, because it's not something that we talk about a lot. So okay, I think we should go on, because we have ideally 3 more sources, although we'll see if we get to all of them. So this next source is one of my favorites, just because I find a lot of humor in it. So this comes from the 3rd chapter of Moed Katan. Moed Katan is about the rules of Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days of festivals. But the 3rd chapter is actually, where this comes from, is actually primarily about the rules of mourning, which is interesting. There are a lot of interesting parallels between the rules of mourning and the rules of Chol HaMoed, not necessarily expected, but that's what we see, for reasons, again, for a different class. But in this particular piece, the rabbis are on a little bit of a digression, because they're talking about whether it is the case that they're talking about whether a person is allowed to betroth a woman, or really a man, let's be honest, whether a man is allowed to betroth a woman on Chol HaMoed, if he is concerned that if he doesn't do so, she will become betrothed to someone else. So in general, there's a principle of what they call in ma'avirin simcha b'simcha. You shouldn't mix one set of joy with another set of joy. And this is the reason why, for example, there traditionally are not weddings during Chol HaMoed, Sukkot, or Pesach. But the question is, if you're not going to do the wedding, but just the betrothal, maybe that should be allowed in order that she not marry someone else. So we're jumping in a little bit in the middle of the story here, because the part we actually care about is the story and not the legal conversation that precedes it. So the Gemara here asks a question, which is, didn't Rav Yehuda say in the name of Shmuel, every day a heavenly voice goes out and says, the daughter of so-and-so for so-and-so, the field of so-and-so for so-and-so? So the idea being, why would it be that they would need to get betrothed during the festival? They should be able to just wait until after, because God has made all of these matches in heaven. You'll notice that the not super flattering, in my opinion, analogy between marriage and the purchasing of a field, right? The purchasing of a daughter and the purchasing of a field, but again, for another time. But the idea being that certain types of relationships, transactions, etc., are determined in the heavens, and therefore you shouldn't need to betroth a woman on Chol HaMoed, because of course she'll be there for you afterwards, because God made the shidduch, right? God made the match in the heavens, and it was announced, and so she's not going to marry someone else. So the question is then, why do we make this exception? And the answer the Gemara gives is rather, lest the woman marry someone else because of prayer. So what exactly does this mean? The Gemara goes on to tell us, like that which happened with Rava, who heard a certain man was praying and said, grant me so and so as a wife. Rava said to him, you should not pray this way. If she is fit for you, if we can just scroll down, please. Thank you. It will not come from you. And if not, meaning if she is not fit for you, you will deny the Lord, right? The idea being, if you're meant to marry this woman, then you're going to marry her because God decided and not because you prayed. So why bother? And if you're not supposed to pray for her, what, you're going to go out and do what God didn't want you to do? So basically, it's all in God's hands. Just trust it. And apparently, though, the man didn't listen and he prayed for it anyway. And after this, Rava heard him say, either let him, meaning me, they often speak about themselves in the third person in the Gemara, let me die before her, or let her die before him. Rava said to him, did I not tell you not to pray in this matter? So what seems to have happened? What seems to have happened is this man, even though Rava told him not to, this man prayed to marry a certain woman, It turned out it was a very bad match. And now he basically says, I wish one of us was dead so that we didn't have to be married anymore. Thank God we live in a society where we now have other options, but this is basically the idea they're putting forward. So, right, what we see here also is that being a rabbi in the time of the Talmud does not mean that you necessarily had extensive pastoral training similar to what we have today at the Jewish Theological Seminary, because Rava, rather than saying, let me counsel you in this moment when things are difficult, he basically says, I told you so, which is not a helpful thing to someone who is so unhappy that they wishes they were dead. But it's this very interesting moment because the Gemara has just suggested that the way that matches are made is they come out from heaven. But now what we're hearing is that if someone prays hard enough, they are able to overturn God's will and marry someone who God did not intend for them. And part of what's really crazy about this is not only can that person do that, but it actually throws off the whole system. Because if he married someone he was not intended for, she's not marrying the person she's intended for. So what happens to that guy? And he's not marrying the person he's intended for. So what's happening to that woman, right? Now everything is messed up. It can mess up the whole system. You make one bad pairing and it messes up the whole system. Again, it's a very particular view of marriage that thankfully we don't share anymore. But this sense that if God heard his prayer, God gave him what he prayed for, even though it actually was not the way it was supposed to be. I think there are two ways to read this. So one way to read it is his prayers were so powerful that he got to marry her, even though he wasn't supposed to. And of course, coming out of that is, this is why you should listen to God, or, you know, the modern equivalent, this is why you should listen to your parents, right? Because they know better. Why? Because what happened? Actually, it was a terrible idea. And there's a reason why they were originally paired for each other. The other way to read it is God is in more control and wants to teach him a lesson about praying things that are not appropriate for praying, about praying for things for which it is not appropriate to pray. In which case, what do you say? You say, God says to him, you think this is what you want? Fine, I'll give it to you, you know, and then I'll show you, and then you can, you'll regret it later on, and then hopefully you won't do this again. Which is not a very flattering image of God. It reminds me a little bit actually of the previous story, the Honi story, where Shimon ben Shattach says to Honi, you're like a spoiled child. That actually very much feels to me like what's happening here also, right? This man is very, very insistent that this is what he wants, and I'm calling him a man, but based on when people got married back then, we might be talking about like a 14-year-old boy. So we just have to want to keep that in perspective. But I don't know. I always feel for the woman in this situation because she had no say in any of this, right? Presumably she didn't pray to marry him. And now she's in this terrible marriage with this man who so much wishes her ill that he's willing to have her dead, right? I'd rather you be dead than me be married to you anymore. And we have no indication that this is what she was asking for. It seems it was only what he was asking for. But in the course of the story, part of what we see is that if you're very insistent, your prayers can be answered, even if it's not actually in your best interest to have them be thus. So as I said in the outset, I think there's a little bit of comedy involved in this. The rabbis certainly have a sense of humor. But also that when we're really insistent that we want something, sometimes God will answer our prayer, whether because God feels that God has to, or whether because God wants to. But what we pray for is not always actually the right or best thing for us. So this is a little bit of an interlude. So I'm going to go now to story number. There's more to say about story number 3, but I think there's even more to say about story 4 and story 5, and I want to make sure we get to them. So I'm going to go on now. So we are now in the Gemara in Tani, and this piece of Gemara follows the Mishnah that we read above, followed the Mishnah that we saw in source number 2. It seems based on the Gemara that Honi did not have sons, he only had daughters. And so there are a series of stories. We're looking only at one of the short ones here, but there are also some longer ones. There are a series of stories that the Gemara brings about the grandsons of Honi, who seem to have inherited their grandfather's ability to pray for things and get those things answered, particularly in terms of rain. Which raises this interesting question of, if we saw Rabbi Chia and his sons as being so meritorious and we weren't totally sure of the appeal of Honi, potentially the answer is part of the appeal of Honi is it's just random genetic lottery, right? It could be that there was something exceptional about Honi that we don't know based on the story, But it also can be that Choni just happened to be a very powerful person who had a strong prayer gene. And it meant that even though his personality was not necessarily the most desirable all of the time, he still had the ability to do this. Or there's maybe some sort of family secret handed down. The Gemara never elucidates one way or the other. But part of what we see when we look at this is there's clearly some sort of family connection between these people and their ability to pray for rain. And by the way, this is the only family that we see where it's not just a single individual, but rather it's a series of generations that people have this ability. So worth noting. So the Gemara tells us, Hanan HaNechba was the son of the daughter of Choni HaMa'agel. When the world was in need of rain, the rabbis would send school children to him. And they would take hold of his hem, the hem of his garment, and say to him, Father, Father, right? They're calling him Abba, 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 please give us rain. Thereupon, he would plead with the Holy One, blessed be he, saying, Ruler of the universe, do it for the sake of those who are unable to distinguish between the Father who gives rain and the Father who does not. Meaning, God, you have these people who they think I'm the one who has the power to give rain. Actually, God, it's you. They don't understand, but please do this thing for them anyway. And the Gemara goes on, why was he called Hanan HaNechba? Because he would often lock Mechabeh himself in the, he would often Mechadya himself in the back room, apparently out of modesty to stop other people coming in. So that's why he's called HaNechba. Hanan is his name, but they give him the second name. So a couple of things I'd like to note about this story. The first is just to talk about the names for a minute, the significance of their names. Hanan and Choni share a root, the same word. And Hanan is the word for mercy, for compassion. Compassion is probably the better translation. So what we see, we say in the 13 attributes of God, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, right? God who is merciful and compassionate. So there's a big debate among scholars of the Talmud about whether or not names are significant. When a rabbi is named something, if the name has meaning, should we read into that or not? But it seems pretty clear to me that in this case, we probably should read something into it, especially in light of the fact that compassion and rain are very much bound up in each other. In the liturgy, they're bound up in each other in the Bible. So this is definitely something we see. So I don't think it's an accident that their names are Hanan and Choni. The second thing I would like to note is that what was ambiguous in the Choni story, which was it wasn't clear if the community themselves had tried praying before turning to Choni and asking him to do this, or if Choni had actually just been, Choni was stop number one. Here it seems pretty clear that Hanan is stop number one. Right? Every time this happens, it doesn't say the rabbis would call a fast, and then if the fast didn't work, then they would send the children to Hanan. Rather, it just says whenever the world was in need of rain, the rabbis would send their school children to him, to Hanan. So I think it's worth noting that if part of the sign of part of what the drought is meant to show us is spiritual deprivation or spiritual disconnect, I think we're really seeing here the way that manifests. And you wonder if the people had, say, trained those school children to pray on their own rather than outsourcing it, then rather than turning to somebody else and saying, please do this on our behalf, would it have turned out differently? Obviously, there's no way to know for sure, but to me, this is a sign of the brokenness of their community. And it's true. And I want to acknowledge what some of you wrote to Rabbi Andelman that she mentioned before about how some of us find comfort in the idea that we can outsource this work, right? We like the idea of having a conduit. But I think to have that conduit, we're still supposed to show up. And in this case, they're not showing up. And the choice to send the children, I think, is an interesting one. Because again, as I keep saying, there are two ways to see that. One way to see that is the school children, it's harder for him to say no to children, right? If you send adults, he'll say, I'm not going to do this for you, go do it yourself. Excuse me, speaking of children, mine has given me a cold, but So one way to read it is that way, right? The assumption is it's harder for him to turn the children away. The other way to read it, of course, is the rabbis make this an errand for children, that even the rabbis are so disconnected that they make this an errand for children. The next thing I want to note is it's pretty clear that Hanan himself is not associated with the rabbis, that he is living at least in a different physical space, that he's not living in the Beit Midrash. He's not spending his time around these teachers, around these rabbis, around these children. It seems that instead he is somewhat removed. This is fairly common in Talmudic stories about miracle makers. Miracle makers are often borderline ascetics who live separate from the rest of society. So that's the second big thing I want to point out here. The third thing is that unlike Honi, who says to God, I am like a member of your household, and so you have to listen to me, Hanan feels very, very strongly that everybody realize that the rain not come from him, right? What is the prayer that he says? Presumably can be overheard by the children. Do it for the sake of those who are unable to distinguish between the Father who gives rain and the Father who does not. It's very important to him that these people understand that Hanan is not the source of the rain. And this concern, of course, is one we see elsewhere. To take a famous example that was just very timely, right? Moses does not appear in the Haggadah by name. Why does Moses not appear by name in the Haggadah? The traditional answer is we don't want people to think that it was Moses who brought us out of Egypt and not God. And so you erase Moses because Moses' job is to be God's messenger. So to here, Hanan says, I can ask for you, but ultimately it's not up to me. I don't decide if it rains. I don't decide if God hears your prayers. Only God can decide that. And I think there's a lot of power in that, because what we saw with his grandfather is that his grandfather very much saw himself as the one who could bring the rain, right? I will not leave this place until it is raining. Hanan says, God, woe to this people who are so far removed from you that they think that I'm the one who's going to bring the rain for them. And I think there's a really beautiful humility in that, in this idea that Hanan can say, similar to what I was saying before, Hanan can ask, but he doesn't get to decide if the answer is yes or no. And he knows that in a way that his grandfather maybe didn't know, or at least didn't acknowledge. And so I think there's a lot of the discipline and the humility that it takes to diminish yourself, even in a moment where other people, all they want to do is build you and your power up, is a tremendously important thing. And I don't want us to miss the fact that that is what Hanan is doing. And in fact, right, he even would lock himself in the bathroom, right? And the explanation Rashi gives there is out of modesty. But I really get the sense of someone who exists in his own world and maybe wants to be alone, but that he will serve as a messenger between God and the people in the moments when he has to. And there's a much, much longer story, not about Hanan, but about it's not clear if it's his brother or his cousin, because also he's just called the son of the daughter of Honi HaMagel. There's a much, much longer version of this story that follows in Ta'anit, follows this story, or no, sorry, immediately precedes it rather, where you see the same sort of thing, this person who's living sort of off the beaten track, who's very, very poor, who doesn't spend his time learning Torah in the Beit Midrash, that for whatever reason, he is the one who is able to go and make it rain, but only through doing a series of things that the rabbis find very strange and almost offensive. And so this idea that it's often the outsiders who can see, and therefore, because they're clear-eyed, the outsiders who can accomplish something that other people who are inside might not be able to. That's a theme really throughout the Talmud. There's a lot to be said about women and the way that women serving as outsiders sometimes in the Talmud have a clearer view or understanding of what's happening around them. But just thinking of this figure as the humble conduit and the humble messenger of God, who is being asked really to communicate in both directions. The last thing I'll point out about this story, and then we'll go to the last one before we pause for comments at the end, is that the one thing that's different in this story is it doesn't tell us if it works. We knew in the first story that it worked because the earth began to shake before the dead could come back to life. We knew it worked in the Choni story because we hear about the rain that comes in 3 different forms. We knew it worked in the Rava story because the man then prays that he or his wife should die, but we know the marriage worked. The assumption here is that it works because it seems that this happens habitually. Whenever the world needed rain, they would go to Hanan Hanachba. But I think it's worth noting that here the author of the story doesn't tell us about the outcome. And I will pause with story number 4 there, and we'll go to story number 5, and then I will pause overall and hear all of your thoughts. So the last story also comes from the same 4th chapter in Ta'anit. And this is one of a series of stories about a man named Hanina ben Dosa. So Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa is, he is called in the Mishnah in Sota, the last of the Anshe Ma'atzah, which literally is the people who do, but is understood to be the last of the miracle makers. And he really lives a very ascetic lifestyle. He is known for eating only 1 kav, which is not very much, only 1 kav of carob each week from 1 week to the next. We hear elsewhere stories of his great poverty and the deprivation experienced by his family. And the other thing we know about him is that he has the ability to know when he prays whether or not his prayers will be answered. This is in the Gemara in Brachot. They talk about that if people needed a prayer to be answered, they would send it to Hanina, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. By the way, you'll notice again the same name, Hanan, Choni, Hanina, not an accident. They would send those prayers to Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, and he would be able to tell them after he prayed the prayers for him whether or not those prayers would be answered. So he's a really interesting figure. I could have done this class on does God have to listen to our prayers just on Hanina ben Dosa, and I'm happy to send people more sources about him. If you're interested, just send me an email. But for now, we're going to look at just one little piece of his story. So I brought this one because it's thematically connected to the idea of rain, which we've seen in 3 out of the 5 stories today. So Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was walking on the road when it began to rain. He said before God, ruler of the universe, the whole world is at ease and Hanina is in distress. The rain then ceased. When he reached home, he said before God, ruler of the universe, is it that the whole world is in distress and Hanina is at ease? The rain fell. So what's happening? He doesn't like it when it rains on his commute, right? And therefore, he basically says to God, while I'm walking, I understand that this rain is good for the world in general, but while I'm walking, this is very uncomfortable for me. And again, you see a little bit of chutzpah here, right? The idea that your discomfort should be equivalent to the benefit that the entire world or neighborhood or land of Israel gets on the rain, but that he's able to effectively do that. And then when he gets home, he says, yeah, okay, I'm comfortable now because I'm at home. But look, the rain needs, right? He turns around and he says, look, God, the world needs rain. What are you doing, right? Who cares that I'm comfortable? The world needs rain. And then it starts to rain again. But part of what's very striking here, and the Gemara actually suggests this in Brachot, it says the world is sustained from week to week because of Hanina ben Dosa. And this is very much played out in this particular story, I think, because what do we see? We see that Hanina ben Dosa, his comfort or discomfort seems to be equally weighted with the comfort or discomfort of the world. So that's an amazingly audacious thing. And here it's not about, oh, the entire world is in a drought and we need you to pray for it to bring for rain. It's not about this is a larger communal need. It's not about let's bring the Messiah. It's just about I don't like it to rain when I'm on my commute. And so therefore, please, will you just make it stop raining until I get home? And then I will ask you to make it start raining again. So Rav Yosef, hearing the story, Rav Yosef lives much later and in Babylonia. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa lives much earlier in the land of Israel. Rav Yosef said, of what avail was the prayer of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest on Yom Kippur, against that of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa? As it was taught, and this is from Masachet Yoma, which is all about the rules of Yom Kippur. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur prayed a short prayer in the outer room of the Beit HaMikdash. So what would happen? The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur would go into the Holy of Holies. The one time of year that he went in there, he would say God's actual name. And then he would come out. And when he was in sort of the antechamber of the of the Holy of Holies before he went back out to the entire community, he would pray a short prayer in this outer room. And the Gemara in Yoma explains that it has to be short because you don't want the people to worry that you died in there, which is a concern. Okay, so then the question is, what did he pray? And the answer the Gemara gives is Ravin, son of Rabbi Ada, and Rava, son of Rabbi Ada, so brothers, both said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, may it be your will, Lord our God, that this year may be one of rain and heat. So the Gemara knows that this is a strange prayer. Is then heat beneficial? On the contrary, it is harmful, right? It's very strange to pray like, hey, can it be hotter outside? Rather, if the year is to be a year of heat, let it also be a year of rain and of dew, and let the prayer of those journeying on the roads gain admission before you. So what do we see? We see essentially the prayer of the Kohen Gadol has two elements. If you look in Yoma, it actually has more elements, and this is actually brought in the Machzor during the Avodah service, the service on Yom Kippur that during Musaf that mirrors the experience of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. So there are other pieces set there, but the idea being basically you pray for a productive year and you pray for the prayers of travelers to be answered. And one of the reasons given for the reason that we don't start praying for rain until Shmini Atzeret, until the end of the Yamim Noraim, is that we don't want it to start raining before the travelers get home. All of these people who went up to the Beit HaMikdash, up to the temple for the Yamim Noraim, we want them to get home comfortably, and then we want it to start raining. So the idea being the Kohen Gadol, the most important, theoretically, the rabbis reject this idea, but theoretically the most important of the Jewish leaders, the one who goes into the Holy of Holies on behalf of the entire nation and says God's name in this really dramatic, important, fraught, terrifying moment. And then he comes out and he prays for rain. And meanwhile, and hopefully his prayer will be answered. And meanwhile, Chalina ben Dosa, who is a very important guy, right? He's an important rabbi, but he just says to God, hey, it's raining on me on my way home. Can you just turn it down a little bit? And then once I get home, you can start it again. And God says, oh yeah, okay. And it raises this really striking contrast, I think, between the pomp and circumstance and the ceremony around the experience of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, and the entire community waiting with bated breath to see what happens with this high priest. And on the other hand, this person who is so in touch with God and so in relationship with God that he can just ask God to sort of turn the weather on and off according to his own comfort, because that relationship is so intimate that he doesn't need that formality. He doesn't need that that sense of the outfit and the moment and the sacrifices, because he's just so keyed into his relationship with God that he can access it at any time. And so, while I'm certainly not suggesting that we all be like Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, I do wonder a little bit what it would be like if we didn't see prayer life as something that happens in a particular corner of our home, or when we make it to synagogue, or on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, or whatever else, but that if we instead saw our conversation with God as being really continuous, in a way that maybe would mirror this piece with Chanina ben Dosa. So we have just 8 minutes left, so I'm going to pause there so that we can take some thoughts, some comments, questions, if there are any.
There are so many great ones. So I wish I could get to all of these. I'll just read just a quick comment in response to, I think, the last few stories. But one person wrote, if my family were to have the powers of getting prayers answered, it would be a great burden, similar to when a person wins the lottery. They get all kinds of requests and demands. So perhaps the line of miracle workers is still active, but hidden, I guess, kind of as an act of mercy or protection for those people. But it's connected actually to the way you responded to my initial comment about imagining yourself as maybe being the person or the one or the family whose prayers God hears. Okay, I don't even know where to start because there are such big topics here. I'm going to tell you the three main themes. I maybe take out a pencil or something. Normally I don't like to do this, but there's just so much. So I'm going to tell you three themes that many people raised, and then you can decide. You can't respond to all of them, so you can decide what you want to share in the last few minutes. So many people raise the idea that they have been told, or they think of it as God hears all prayers. Sometimes the answer is no, which is right, maybe more palatable than God only hears some people's prayers. And it's comforting in a way. It's better than God only listening to some people. It's better than thinking that God isn't there and maybe God knows better. But then of course it's also it's problematic when bad things are happening that there's no justifiable explanation for, right? Then you get into what kind of God is hearing these prayers and saying no. But that was one theme that came up. Another theme that came up was the fact that we pray. This came up actually in our session with Michal Springer last month, praying for things that we can't realistically expect, or that God seems to manifestly not be providing, whether that's healing for someone who's terminally ill, or financial or agricultural blessing that just never comes. So should you even pray for those things? How are you supposed to pray for those things with kavanah, with intention? So that was another theme that came up. And then a third theme that a few people raised was, the fact that people pray for conflicting things. This you mentioned this sort of as almost a side comment in, I think it was story 3, right? The prayer of this guy who wants to marry this girl, if we're assuming they're young folks, and we don't even know if she's interested at all, right? So how do we think about that, about the fact that people can be praying for opposite things, which can be on an individual level, or actually I'm reminded of Bob Dylan's song "With God on Our Side," right? You could have entire people's feeling that what they're praying for is an appropriate and right thing to be asking God for help with, and other people would ask for exactly the opposite. So there were lots of other wonderful comments, but those were 3 that several people raised. So sorry to throw all that at you, and let's hear in 4 minutes. You pick what you want to respond to.
Okay, there's a lot there. So first, I just want to say I would that I knew the answer to any of these questions. I feel like I would have such wisdom and such power. And I do want to speak to the idea that maybe you wouldn't want to be the person whose prayers are always answered. I think that that's true. I think the burden of that is tremendous. And speaking, that actually links very nicely, I think, to the third theme that we just heard about, because if an individual or even a community asks for something, there's no guaranteeing that that's not going to end up being to the detriment of another individual or community. And so that's part of what's really difficult, right? There are many conflicts in the world that exist because there are 2 sides that both believe that their side is right, and the 2 really are mutually exclusive. So I think that that's part of what's very, very hard about all of this. I think I want to speak to the first one, right? That God hears all prayers, but sometimes the answer is no. It solves one theological problem, which is, if we believe that God is there and hearing us, then how come this thing that I passionately am asking for, right, with my entire self, isn't being answered? Sometimes, as we see in story number 3, where the man gets what he prayed for and it's not in his best interest, sometimes it seems that the answer to that question is, because actually you're better off not having that prayer be answered. Right, he would have been better. I mean, the question remains, like, would he have just longed for that woman forever instead? And then, he wouldn't have, he potentially could have been unhappy either way, I guess is what I'm saying. But of course, no, I think that idea that sometimes God answers and the answer is no, and sometimes we pray for things where we know the answer is going to be no. I think those 2 things are actually very connected with each other. Like they're 2 separate things, but I think they're intimately connected. Sometimes prayer is about an opportunity to just release our pain or sadness or grief into the world. And I think that there's power in doing that, even if we know that there's not going to be a happy resolution. And I think the rabbis believe that also, by the way. Like, we shouldn't, these are 5 very, very small snippets from an extremely long body of work. And we shouldn't assume that that the rabbis assume that in all cases, if you're righteous enough, God will hear your prayers. That's not their operating theology. I think that in moments where we hear about or encounter really, really terrible things, there's a reason why our instinct is to pray even in the aftermath. Like, I remember, after I was in high school during 9/11, after 9/11, everyone wanted to go to synagogue or church or the mosque, right? Well, the mosque was more complicated for reasons we won't go into right now, right? But like, I remember going to shul that Friday night, and they had to add a second Friday night service because everyone wanted to come to shul, and there still wasn't space for everybody. And so I think part of it is sometimes prayer is a way for us to be in community, right? What did we do after the horrible shooting in Pittsburgh? Like, there was a vigil on the Upper West Side, a prayer vigil at Anshe Chesed, and like, again, lines around the block. Everyone wanted to come and be in that experience. And so I think sometimes prayer is about not necessarily thinking, and that's in the aftermath, right? That's when the horrible thing has already happened. And so I think sometimes what prayer is about is an opportunity to feel like we can pour out our grief without judgment. And I think that that's a really powerful thing as well. And I think actually the rabbis believe that too, not necessarily in the same form, but this sense of me expressing what it is that I wish, even if I know that wish won't come true. I think there's real benefit to that experience, because it allows us to articulate the things that are causing us pain. And sometimes in the course of that articulation, that's when people find out that we're in need or we're able to come together. And therefore, the prayer that we made may not have been answered, but there's a different sort of comfort that can come in that moment. Because sometimes the solution doesn't come in the form of prayers being answered. Sometimes it comes in the comfort of your community, or in seeing something in a different way, or in a different outcome that you might not have expected, all of those other pieces. And so I wonder if sometimes that's the answer. But yeah, I mean, to me, being a congregational rabbi, being a chaplain, right? Those to me seem like some of the hardest jobs in the world, because part of what you have to do is sit with people in their pain, even knowing that you can't fix it. Because even the great Hanina Ben-Dosa can't pray in such a way that he brings someone back to life, for example, right? That is beyond even his capacity. There are limits to what our prayers can do, but that doesn't mean that there's not a benefit in engaging with them anyway. So I think that's what I'll stop with, because we're out of time.
Thank you. Right. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways that, then this can be a whole other session or series, that there are a lot of ways to think about the efficacy of prayer that's not about being answered. And certainly in case I created any misimpression, right? I talked about that one unique prayer experience of my life, that I've had thousands of other meaningful, valuable, important spiritual prayer experiences that I didn't necessarily feel like it was going somewhere and being heard, and yet there was so much value nonetheless. Thank you for kicking off this session. I think that, and for the series, I think that a lot of these themes are going to resurface. So you put many great questions on the table for us, and just showed a lot of nuance in these, this set of stories that you selected for us, pointing out these different ways of relating to God, as the name of the series asked you to do. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us, and hope you join us next week. Very different session. We have a Bible session next week. Professor Ben Summer will be teaching about the gender of God, which kind of understanding that from an ancient Israelite and archaeological perspective, but of course, that can raise theological questions for us as well today. So kind of a different set of questions about relating to God. So I hope everyone will join us then. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Rosenthal, once again for just a really interesting and thought-provoking and comment-provoking session. I thank everyone for all your comments too, and sorry we didn't have time for more of them. Thank you. We'll see you all soon.
Thank you.